I would now like to ask Julie Raines, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice, Michael Alumni, our Distinguished Alumni Award honoree, and Joan Gambeski, Class of 1983 and Officer of the Alumni Association Executive Board, to please come forward. Dr. Raines will read the citation honoring Mr. Alumni, and the Distinguished Alumnus Medal will be placed by President Murray and Mrs. Gambeski.
Michael O'Looney. From television journalism to public service to high finance, you have proved throughout your career that good communications are fundamental to the success of any organization. As a communication major here at Marist in the 80s, you were involved with the theater program, which surely helped earn you an on-air spot in 1993 with the fledgling cable news station New York One. Your work there earned you positions with ever-increasing exposure and responsibility: reporter and anchor for WCBS, correspondent for CBS Evening News. Your Emmy-nominated reporting covered some of the biggest national and international stories of our time: 9/11, the death of John F. Kennedy Jr., the crash of TWA Flight 800, an important series on Interpol, narcotics, weapons, and human trafficking, all of which prepared you well for what came next. You took on the role of Deputy Commissioner for Public Information for the New York Police Department, the nation's largest and most complex municipal police force, just months after the shock of 9/11. At the NYPD, you wasted no time putting the other duties as assigned part of your job description to work. You've earned a page on IMDb by playing a reporter in the movie City Hall and HBO's The Sopranos. But your most important acting job came just 2 weeks into your time at the NYPD. An armed man was holding an NYPD detective hostage at a station house and demanding to speak to a reporter. Armed with your old CBS News business card, you volunteered for the role and spoke to the hostage taker for 3 hours before he surrendered peacefully. He knew he was going to jail, you told a reporter at the time, but he wanted to get his story out. The following year, you were walking in Manhattan when you recognized a crime suspect from a surveillance tape you just released that day to the media. You pursued him into a nearby subway station where a police officer and some good Samaritans joined you in chasing and tackling the man before he was arrested. When you later left the NYPD to head communications for Merrill Lynch, Commissioner Ray Kelly called you, quote, a consummate professional who did an outstanding job of communicating to the public on behalf of the police department during a historical and transformational period in our history, unquote. You were later inducted into the NYPD's Honor Legion. More recently, you've had increasingly important roles in financial corporate communications, first at Merrill Lynch, then Barclays, and now at Elliott Management, where you run global communications for an organization that manages $27 billion in assets. You graciously give your time here at Marist, where you sit on the advisory board for the School of Communication and the Arts, and regularly come to campus to speak with students and provide valuable career advice and connections. You also serve on the board of Columbia University's Knight Bagehot Fellowship, the most prestigious of its kind in business journalism. In recognition of these achievements, as well as for your embodiment of the principles of your alma mater, Marist College, the Board of Trustees proudly awards you the Marist College Distinguished Alumni Medal.
Ladies and gentlemen, our 2016 commencement speaker, Michael Alumni. Michael, congratulations.
Well, thank you. This is a wonderful honor, and it's so nice to be back home at Marist. I'd like to thank the Board of Trustees, the faculty, and President Murray, and I just want to take a moment to thank President Murray for all that he's done for the Marist community over the last 4 decades. You have transformed Marist into one of the top-ranked colleges in the nation, and you've done it all with vision, determination, and grace. We want to thank you and wish you all the best. I also want to thank you, the graduates, and the families, for letting me share this special day with you. You should be very proud of what you've achieved. You've done what few others have accomplished. You have earned your graduate degree while at the same time balancing all the demands of life. When President Murray asked me to give the commencement address, I said yes. And then about 10 minutes later, I thought, I need to come up with something to say that's worthy of this occasion. That's a little unfair, of course, since I only have an undergraduate degree. But I spent a lot of time asking advice, seeking pearls of wisdom, bouncing ideas off friends, and most importantly, my family, my wife, Annika, my sons, Luke and Blake. I was talking to Blake this morning. He's 9, and he said, Dad, just be silly. If you talk, they're going to fall asleep. And Luke said, Dad, just don't be boring. I'll try not to be. In the end, I decided all I could really do today was tell you in 8 quick minutes the story of my career, how it began, where it ended up, and maybe a couple of things along the way that I've learned. I think my story is about how in a life full of changes, some invited, some completely unforeseen, it's not just about your ability to adapt, but your ability to stay the same, to know who you are and to still recognize yourself no matter where you are on that path. When I left Marist, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and that was to be a broadcast journalist. Along the way, I veered into law enforcement and now work in finance, and I never saw those careers coming. For the first 16 years, I worked my way up through a series of jobs in radio and television until I made it to New York, and I was reporting for CBS News. I loved being a reporter. It had purpose and meaning. It was fun and exciting. I got to meet and interview amazing people and cover amazing stories. I had the honor of anchoring on September 11th and trying to help people make sense of what was happening on that terrible day to our city and to our country. It was a career I could only have dreamed of. And then one day, I got a phone call. It was an early Saturday morning in 2001, and that call changed the direction of my life. Michael Bloomberg had just been elected mayor, and he had named Ray Kelly as his incoming police commissioner. And Ray Kelly was calling me, I think it was 7 o'clock in the morning, to ask if I'd be interested in joining the NYPD as a deputy commissioner, acting as the department's chief spokesperson. I was honored and excited. Ray Kelly was someone I deeply admired, and I would be joining his team at a historic time in the history of New York. This was only 8 weeks after 9/11. Ground Zero was still burning. Bodies were still being recovered. National Guard troops were still patrolling the streets of Manhattan. And there was still a very real fear that another terror attack could happen at any time. I talked the offer over with my wife, Annika, and I accepted the job. And while I was thrilled, another part of me deep inside was unsure. Was I making a mistake leaving CBS just as my career was taking off there? Would I be any good at my new job? Would I succeed? Would I fail? And some of these were real concerns. I had never managed anyone in my life, and now I would be managing 40 people in one of the busiest press offices in the country. I was also coming in as a 36-year-old outsider, a civilian joining a leadership team made up of NYPD veterans in their 50s and 60s. Would they accept me? I pushed those doubts aside, and I started my new career. Now, there are 100 small things that I could point to tell you about how I made that adjustment to the NYPD. But in reality, everything changed in that one night that Julie mentioned, just 8 days into my tenure, and it started with another phone call. This time the call came at midnight from a sergeant informing me that a detective had been taken hostage inside the 19th Precinct Station House on the Upper East Side. A man was holding a 9mm to the back of a detective's head, threatening to kill him unless he could talk to a reporter and tell the world about his conspiracy theories. Since I had been a reporter recently, I was quickly drafted into that role. The detective was being held in an interrogation room with a one-way mirror so police could see what was happening inside of that room. And the Emergency Service Unit, which is the NYPD's version of a SWAT team, had set up 2 sniper positions ready to take that gunman out on a moment's notice. On the other side of the door was the hostage negotiator who was trying to engage the gunman. Minutes later, I found myself standing next to that negotiator behind a Kevlar shield, wearing a flak jacket and a helmet, with 15 heavily armed officers behind me ready to storm the room. For the next few hours, we tried to reason with the gunman and convince him to release the detective, and every time we thought we were getting there, he'd have a flash of anger, threaten to kill the detective unless we listened to more of his rantings. As the night wore on, I wondered how this would end. There were several outcomes, and two of them were very bad. What if I said the wrong thing? What if I had used the wrong tone? I felt the weight of that detective's life in my hands, and behind me stood the police commissioner and the top brass of the department, watching and listening as the night played out. And outside, behind the police tape, were dozens of reporters, my old colleagues, covering the story. After 3 hours, the gunman gave up, the officer stormed the room, and the detective was released unharmed. And I learned a lot about myself that night, that I could keep my composure under extreme pressure, that I would never really be prepared for all that life could throw at me, and that sometimes good communication is the difference between life and death. After that night, I was immediately accepted by the top brass of the department. I had proved myself. And as I grew into that job, I learned that the part I had dreaded the most, managing people, was something that I liked the most. And I noticed that in the 16 years I'd worked as a journalist, no boss had ever asked my opinion on anything of substance. And now the police commissioner of New York was asking my advice on major issues. I thrived under that pressure. I loved the responsibility, and I was growing as a person. 2 years later, I got another call. A friend had recommended me to the CEO of Merrill Lynch, and I was offered a job running corporate communications for one of the largest firms on Wall Street. I was thrilled, but again, there was another part of me deep inside that was unsure. Was I leaving the NYPD just as my career there was thriving? What did I know about Wall Street? Would I succeed? Would I fail? But I pushed those fears aside, and I took the job. And for the next 3 years, it was great. Every quarter was better than the last. And then the credit crisis hit, and Merrill Lynch began to melt down. The CEO I worked for was ousted, and the company was later sold to the Bank of America. But even in the worst of that crisis, I found the work rewarding. I was helping senior management navigate its way through the crisis. And I always knew, no matter how bad it got on Wall Street, it was never a matter of life and death. I knew the difference. I've noticed a few themes in my career. Almost every job I've gotten has come from a friendship or a relationship I've had with someone who believed in me. Take care of your professional relationships. Be there for people. Go out of your way for them. Every time I was offered a new opportunity, there was a side of me that resisted because I wasn't sure I was ready for that next step. But I don't think you can ever really be ready for the next chapter. When you are presented with opportunities and hear those doubts, listen to them. Weigh the pros and cons. Not every opportunity will be right. But don't let the fear that you may have trap you in a small life when you want a big life. There are many things you can't control in your career, like a hostage situation or a credit crisis. But you can control yourself, how you carry yourself, how hard you work, how you treat people, how many times you decide to answer the phone call in the middle of the night. Of course, in the end, I'm happy those calls came, and I'm happy that I took them, because here's the thing. When I left Marist, I knew exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and I'm so glad I was so wrong. Thank you, and congratulations.